On the morning of 13th of June 1944, during the fierce battles in Normandy, SS Obersturmführer Wittmann and the crew of his heavy Tiger tank were standing ready for action. They were about to take part in one of the most famous tank actions in military history. Wittmann had left his company to reconnoiter the battlefield when he became aware of the presence of an entire British armoured battalion halted on the road nearby. Undaunted, Wittmann drove his single Tiger at the column, firing on the move. The Tiger gained the element of surprise and quickly destroyed 12 half-tracks, 3 light tanks, and 6 medium tanks.
One of the most striking examples, of course, not so much of tank warfare, but of the handling of an individual tank. Indeed, what it could do and its capability was demonstrated in 1944 by Hauptmann Wittmann in his Tiger tank. Here you've got an accomplished tank commander, which he clearly was, with perhaps an expert eye for the tactical situation. And I think it's probably a record in tank warfare history that he was able with one tank to disable what was virtually a British tank column.
Wittmann calmly departed the scene of carnage to report, rearm, and gather reinforcements. 2 hours later, he returned to battle. This time he destroyed a further 12 medium tanks, 4 heavy tanks, and 14 Bren gun carriers. All in a day's work for the most successful tank commander in history.
Michael Wittmann was really probably the most successful junior tank commander of the entire Second World War. Not only did he achieve an unprecedentedly high kill rate, 138 tanks, 132 anti-tank guns, but he was also the recipient of some of Nazi Germany's highest awards, for example, the Knight's Cross with Oak Leaves and Swords, which was effectively the German equivalent of the Victoria Cross. So in sheer statistical terms, he was an extremely successful commander. He was also an extremely competent leader, an inspirational leader, one might say. And this, I think, leads on to something else which is also important, which is Michael Wittmann's propaganda value to the Nazi propaganda machine. It wasn't simply a question of what he did on the battlefield. It was his influence and his inspiration to other German fighting men and to the factory workers who produced the Tiger tanks with which Wittmann achieved most of his victories that was also particularly important. So regardless of what one thinks of his political viewpoint, and of course he was a dedicated National Socialist, in sheer military terms at the tactical level, and in terms of his psychological impact, both upon Germans and indeed upon the Allies, his impact was immense.
Michael Wittmann was born in the tiny village of Vogeltal in the Upper Pfalz on the 22nd of April 1914. He was the first son of a farmer, Johann Wittmann, and his wife Ursula. In 1934, at the age of 21, Wittmann joined the German army, signing up for a 2-year tour. In the first days of the Nazi regime, compulsory military service had not yet been reintroduced, so Wittmann was a volunteer when he reported for military service in Freising with the 19th Infantry Regiment. As a small standing army, comprised exclusively of volunteers, the interwar Reichswehr was a high-quality force which expected very high standards. Wittmann met those exacting standards, and after 1 year in the service, he was promoted to Gefreiter on the 1st of November 1935. 1936 was the halcyon period for the Nazi Party in Germany. The first flushes of economic successes for Hitler's National Socialists impressed the young Wittmann. In the closed world of the military, the fervent Nazi beliefs of many of his colleagues also made an impression. Many of his colleagues planned to join the newly formed Waffen-SS, and Wittmann decided that he too would join the military wing of the Nazi Party after his own army service. On the 1st of November 1936, Wittmann applied for admission to the SS and was accepted into what was to become one of the most notorious organizations in history.
The Waffen-SS, or armed SS, was essentially the regular armed forces or ideological spearhead of the National Socialist cause, composed, at least in its early stages, of racially pure, ideologically utterly committed and extremely physically fit young men. It eventually grew to a strength by 1945 of almost 1 million personnel and provided something like 40 combat divisions for the German armed forces.
The Waffen-SS actually stands for armed SS, so that they are specifically fighting soldiers. And they were unusual in that they were very innovative in their tactics and also things like their dress. They were some of the first troops to use camouflage clothing.
In the case of many exceptional German soldiers, such as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, revisionists have subsequently tried to play down the enthusiasm they held for Hitler and all he stood for. This is not true of Michael Wittmann. In his case, there was to be no redeeming conversion or late change of allegiance. He was a simple man, and the seductive allure of the Nazi Party drew his unquestioning obedience. Sadly, he was never to swerve from that evil path. Wittmann was given the SS number 311623 and proved to be a model National Socialist. In his free time, he participated in sports, recruiting, and took part in the mass political demonstrations and rallies of the period. In contrast to the frantic world of mass political rallies, Wittmann's first SS military posting was less than glamorous. He was employed as a guard at the large Wehrmacht munitions dump. Wittmann was soon bored with his routine. He wanted to be near the center of this new force in Germany, so he applied to join the SS Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard. Already, this was the best known and most elite unit in the Third Reich.
The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler might reasonably be described as Hitler's Praetorian Guard. Formed in 1933 as a bodyguard for the Führer personally, it later expanded as the military vanguard of National Socialism, if you like, and in 1943 eventually became a fully fledged panzer division of the Waffen-SS with a strength of about 20,000 men. Both as a division and earlier as a regiment, it participated on the most important fronts of the Second World War, acting as an armoured spearhead for German offensive actions and as a fire brigade that was sent to collapsing sectors of the front in order to prop them up. So an absolutely elite formation.
Thanks to his rigorous military background, Wittmann met the very strict selection criteria and was accepted. He began training with his new unit on the 5th of April 1937 at the main cadet school in Berlin-Leicherfeld. Wittmann was assigned to the 17th Company, which was an armoured scout car platoon. As part of an elite formation, the men of the Armoured Scout Company received an intensive training course, which transformed them into experts. These skills were later to stand him in good stead, but for the time being, the newfound expertise was not needed. Hitler was still achieving his aims by a mixture of bluff and inspired gambles. In October 1938, Wittmann took part in the entry into the Sudetenland. The reception he witnessed as waves of excitement swept through the people made a lasting impression on him. The storm of jubilation eclipsed even the fervent National Socialist rallies which he had attended. He was awarded his first of many medals, commemorating the reunification of Austria and the Sudetenland with the German Reich. From now on, medals and decorations would occupy a special place in Wittmann's affections. The first moves in Hitler's master plan had been achieved without bloodshed. But as tensions rose, Adolf Hitler's crooked path led only downwards into chaos. The conquest of Poland heralded the coming of the Second World War. The Leibstandarte motorized regiment fought hard in Poland from the first day of the campaign, the 1st of September, 1939. On that day, the armored scout platoon was soon in action, and Wittmann had received his baptism of fire. The campaign in Poland was brief, only 30 days in duration, but nonetheless, his experiences had whetted his appetite for combat. In the following year, Wittmann and his armored car again saw action in the rapid campaign, which saw the fall of France. Wittmann, together with several other NCOs and men, was transferred to Göteborg, where the self-propelled assault battery was being formed. There, he and his colleagues traded in their black panzer uniforms for grey assault gun tunics. It was to be 2 years before he would see panzer black again. This was the start of Wittmann's association with armored fighting vehicles, which was to lead him to fame and infamy throughout the civilized world. There was much to learn. The assault guns were armed with the short-barreled 75mm gun, which had little in common with the feeble 20mm cannon carried by the armored cars. But Wittmann soon showed exceptional promise with a new weapon. After training, the fledgling assault gun battery was sent to garrison duty in France. After the short burst of activity which had characterized the lightning campaign through France, the long months of barracks duty hung heavy on Wittmann, who was keen to see action again. He was not to get his wish until the 6th of April 1941, when the Balkans campaign began. The German forces advanced through Yugoslavia to Greece, where, in addition to Greek forces, their opponents included English and Commonwealth troops. Wittmann's assault gun was involved in the fierce fighting for the Klidi Pass, which fell only after heavy resistance. Next, the Leibstandarte had to fight its way through the Kliswa Pass and on to Corinth and Olympia against fierce opposition from the Greek army. The fighting in Greece ended on the 30th of April 1941. After pausing to rest in Thessalia in May, the Leibstandarte was sent through Yugoslavia to Camp Diditz near Wischau, where awaited the next phase of the war, the invasion of Russia. The war in Russia began with Operation Barbarossa on June the 22nd, 1941. But the Leibstandarte wasn't initially committed. Their war in the Soviet Union began a month later, in July 1941. It was like a second baptism of fire for Michael Wittmann, who faced an attack by 18 Russian tanks on the battery's first day of action. He had encountered nothing like this in Poland or Greece, but Wittmann was a natural fighter, and he succeeded in knocking out 6 enemy tanks in succession. The rest fled the field in disarray. This was Wittmann's first striking success, and the incident provided the first signs of his supreme talent as commander of an armored fighting vehicle. On the 12th of July, 1941, in recognition of his great feat on his first day in action in Russia, Wittmann was decorated with the Iron Cross, 2nd class. But there was little time for celebration as the advance continued. The short 75mm gun of the German assault gun in the early war years was an inferior weapon to the long 76mm gun of the Russian T-34 tanks. But despite this disadvantage, Wittmann proved himself a master of armored warfare. Combat in Russia placed terrific demands on the assault gun crews. Frequently, Wittmann and his crew were on their own, separated from the rest of the assault gun battery. In this hostile environment, he proved himself to be an individualist and a successful lone fighter. Nevertheless, he remained popular with his comrades. Wittmann's gunner at that time, Otto Schult, described him as a modest man. Michael was a quiet, gifted, friendly NCO, with firm goals in front of him.
He knew his tank. In a sense, he also knew his opponent, positioned himself beautifully, and every time there was an attempt even to, if you like, outflank him or remove him or in a sense, put the pressure on him, that failed as well.
With 2,000 miles of front to fight over, the German armored forces were spread incredibly thinly. It was lucky for Wittmann that he was such a good lone warrior, as the assault guns were rarely employed en masse, as the standing orders required, so his skills were forged in the hard battles of the summer of 1941. Unit commanders were always happy to have an assault gun assigned to their sector, particularly that commanded by Michael Wittmann. The German advance along the Black Sea began in the first weeks of August 1941. Wittmann fought near Sasseljae and Neujaburg from the 10th to the 17th of August, and on the 19th captured Kherson. In the course of the fighting for the port city of Kherson, a bizarre incident took place as the assault guns commanded by Wittmann and Beck engaged first an enemy gunboat, then a submarine. The gunboat was sunk, but the effects of the fire directed at the submarine are not recorded. Wittmann had destroyed 10 enemy tanks by this point in his career. But his luck was about to change for the worse, as a direct hit on his vehicle, which failed to penetrate the armor, nonetheless left Wittmann wounded in the face and back by shell fragments.
Tank crews in battle faced a large number of different kinds of danger. Most obviously there were the dangers posed by similar beasts to themselves, enemy tanks, assault guns, tank destroyers, and self-propelled guns. In addition, of course, the enemy would often have anti-tank guns, towed anti-tank guns, which by virtue of their smaller size were easier to hide. And indeed, Michael Wittmann reckoned that it was more of a coup to destroy enemy anti-tank guns than to destroy enemy tanks. In addition, tank crews faced dangers posed by enemy infantry equipped with short-range anti-tank weapons. They had to deal with problems caused by anti-tank ditches, by trenches, by minefields, and so forth. And in addition, of course, there were the simple ergonomic problems of operating in battle. Tanks tended to be festooned inside with all sorts of equipment, some of it sharp, and over rough ground tank crews could be thrown around and find that they impacted with this equipment, which wasn't terribly pleasant. But perhaps the paramount fear for most tank crews was that of fire, because in very small confined spaces, this meant that tank crews only had a matter of seconds usually to evacuate a damaged vehicle.
In late August, after the capture of Kherson, Wittmann rested near Bobrinets. In recognition of his accomplishments to date, on the 8th of September, Michael Wittmann was awarded the Iron Cross, First Class. By then, he was already counted as the best gun commander in the battery and an indispensable member of the Liebstandard. The German advance continued through the eastern Ukraine. Tagranog was taken on the 17th of October. By this stage, Michael Wittmann, who had been wounded a total of 3 times in 1941, was now promoted to the rank of SS Oberscharführer. The Liebstandard had been bloodied in the constant action of the previous months, and the combat strengths of his units had fallen to dangerously low levels. Despite this, the units continued to drive eastwards, and on the 17th of November 1941, the attack on Rostov on the Don began. The city was only captured after further fierce fighting. On the 21st of November, Michael Wittmann was awarded the Tank Battle Badge in silver. The Liebstandarte moved into the winter positions along the Sambeck River. The assault gun battery was based in Taganrog. From there, the assault gun carried out armoured reconnaissance sorties to the east and north. Tank combat was comparatively rare at this period, as the Soviets had few tanks left in action by this stage of the war. Nonetheless, Wittmann's tally continued to rise to 25 enemy tanks and 32 anti-tank guns destroyed. But combat losses were not just on the Russian side. Those on his own side also rose steadily. In February 1942, the depleted assault gun battery was reinforced and brought up to battalion strength through new additions from Germany and the transfer of a battery from the SS Viking division. As a result of this expansion, Wittmann was made an SS officer candidate in early 1942. He left the battalion in June in order to attend the candidate training course at the SS Junkerschule in Bad Tölz. Wittmann learned tactical lessons, which he combined with his practical battlefield experience. The 28-year-old Wittmann now served as platoon commander in the 2nd Company of the SS Panzer Replacement Battalion. During his time away from action, Michael Wittmann was promoted to SS Untersturmführer. On Christmas Day 1942, he received his transfer to Fallingbostel for the formation of the new heavy tank company. Wittmann once again exchanged his grey assault gun uniform for a black panzer uniform. There were rumors of a new miracle weapon which fired the anticipation of Michael Wittmann and his colleagues. Armies are full of rumors, but for once, these rumors were true. The Germans were indeed to be equipped with the mighty Tiger tanks, but there was also disappointment for Wittmann. Each Tiger company had a few of the old Panzer IIIs for scouting and support. As he had experience in armored cars and had trained using these machines, Wittmann was assigned to a Panzer III, not a Tiger. Wittmann was anxious for a Tiger of his own, but he had a long wait. He never missed the opportunity to state that his wish was still to command a heavy tank. Finally, in March 1943, he achieved his aim and stood for the first time in the turret of a Tiger as its commander. Wittmann could afford no time to reflect on his new status. The strategic situation on the Russian front was desperate, and the Tigers were pitched straight into action. Massive tank duels, the bitter one-to-one combats, and tank battles against anti-tank guns were the daily work of Michael Wittmann. His first great moment of triumph came in the titanic Battle of Kursk.
For sheer scale and intensity of combat, Kursk is almost unparalleled in recent military history. In particular, the engagement around the village of Prokhorovka on the 12th of July 1943, when something like 1,000 tanks of the SS Panzer Corps on one side and of the 5th Guards Tank Army on the Russian side were concentrated in an area of a few square miles. So I think that's what makes the Battle of Kursk particularly unique.
On the day that the Great Battle began, Wittmann destroyed 8 tanks. In the following tank battles, Wittmann emerged as an unmatched tank ace. He overran batteries, picked out even the most cleverly camouflaged anti-tank gun nests, and constantly outfought enemy tanks. He was cautious when he had to be, aggressive when it paid off. His keen hunter instinct, combined with a huge slice of luck, allowed him to emerge unscathed through 5 furious days of the biggest tank battles in history. Over and over again, enemy tanks went up like blazing torches before him. And when Michael Wittmann washed his sweaty, powder-smeared face on the evening of the 5th day of the battle, he knew that he had left behind him 30 wrecked T-34s, 28 Soviet anti-tank guns, and 2 batteries of artillery destroyed. Wittmann continued his success in late autumn. Near Brusilov, he ran into a Soviet tank assembly area, taking the enemy by surprise. And in that single action, blasted 10 tanks from the mass of Soviet armor. 3 more fell prey to his Tiger later that afternoon. Wittmann marked every tank destroyed, but he rated the anti-tank guns he destroyed twice as high. He hated these concealed nests, which he called the hiding places of death. He derived special satisfaction when he destroyed an anti-tank gun. By this stage of the war, Wittmann professed that enemy tanks had ceased to be a strain on his nerves, and only the anti-tank guns still made him uncomfortable. He described them as lurking in their lairs, and so much more difficult to spot than tanks. The keen Nazi propaganda department were keen to capitalize on Wittmann's success, and a war writer was sent to join him in his tank. He filed this report. In an attack against a large town, guarded strongly by tanks and anti-tank guns, we cleared the way rather quickly by destroying several tanks and anti-tank guns, and soon reached the town. Our targets were all to the right of our direction of travel, from our 12 to approximately 3 o'clock positions. Suddenly, to our left, behind a haystack, we sighted a Joseph Stalin 1 with its gun trained on us. Wittmann, turn left, target 100 meters, go. And that was it. This action resulted in the destruction of 15 enemy tanks in a single day. Wittmann frequently maneuvered the Tiger based on his experience in assault guns. From a static position, he would swing the whole vehicle round, rather than waste time moving the turret. Moving the Tiger in this way was accomplished by one track turning forward and the other in reverse. This called for extreme caution with the Tiger, however, because of the great danger of shedding one of the huge tracks while turning in place. The tracks turning in opposite directions caused soil to accumulate under the idler wheels and the tracks to snap. Unlike most tank crews, Wittmann's gunner, Bobby Voll, often fired without a target designation from his commander, for as Wittmann frequently put it, there was no time for a conversation. And Bobby Voll often acquired the target in the few split seconds which meant the difference between life and death.
The Tiger tank was instrumental, I think, to Michael Wittmann's success. It was a beast of enormous lethality, but in Michael Wittmann's hands, it really reached its full potential in a manner which very few other German tank commanders ever achieved. Having said that, I think it's also true to say that not only did the Tiger make Michael Wittmann, but Michael Wittmann made the Tiger. The psychological impact of the Tiger tank, which was already considerable and indeed justified, was radically increased by Michael Wittmann's excellence in command of Tiger tanks and by the propaganda that the Germans were able to make using his success. So it's a rather symbiotic or synergistic relationship I think we're looking at.
The Tiger is an awesome weapon. If you combine that with experienced tank crews, you must remember at the time that the Germans had been through the fighting in Poland, some of them even been in Spain, through the Balkans, France, and they've got a large core of highly motivated, very effective troops that are able to use any of the new weapons they come out with, and they would save the Tiger for the best of those troops. Now, Wittmann had obviously shown himself very well during the course of the early part of the war, and so the opportunity to fight in the Tiger seems a very good match.
On the 15th of January 1944, armoured groups of Liebstandarte and Das Reich divisions were ordered to drive further northwest in the direction of Ljubal. This armoured advance was stopped principally by heavy fire from anti-tank guns and mortars. Those 2 days of intense fighting saw Wittmann destroy 6 enemy tanks, 20 anti-tank guns, 60 guns, 32 trucks, and countless other vehicles. On the 16th of January 1944, both Wittmann and Bobby Woll received the Knight's Cross. Woll was the first soldier holding rank as low as gunner to be awarded such a high decoration. There were now 2 wearers of the Knight's Cross in Wittmann's Tiger. As a member of Wittmann's crew, Woll's success surpassed that of every other gunner in the winter battles of 1943 and 1944. By the 13th of January, he had destroyed 80 tanks and 107 anti-tank guns. Bobby Woll played an important part in the success of Michael Wittmann. With his quick reactions and good eye, he was a master behind the mighty 88 gun. Confident of Woll's ability, Wittmann was not intimidated and would often take on superior numbers of enemy tanks. The two made a fine team, and Woll knew Wittmann's ways to the letter. While a crew's driver, radio operator and loader often changed, the commander and gunner stayed together whenever possible. The commander of a Tiger was closely tied to his gunner, and their actions had to be well coordinated. Making up the rest of Wittmann's crew, posing here for propaganda photographs in January 1944, were Werner Ergang, radio operator, Eugene Schmidt, driver, and Sepp Robner, loader. As the gunner, Woll was of decisive importance. The enemy's next shot could mean the end of them all if his aim was poor.
Balthasar Woll, Michael Wittmann's Tiger gunner, used a rather idiosyncratic method. He preset his sights to 800 meters, which was the kind of average length at which, or distance at which a Tiger would engage a target, and he would then correct for targets that were closer or further away, using his great experience and essentially intuition in order to fire the gun either higher or lower than the point which was directed by the sight. So a very quick and efficient way of firing the gun.
The rings on the barrel of Wittmann's Tiger each represent 10 tanks destroyed. The Tigers were feared by the Soviets, and the heavy German tanks often drew heavy anti-tank fire in their attacks. They were used as weapons to smash gaps in enemy positions for the grenadiers to move up in support. In countless attacks, they breached anti-tank fronts and destroyed enemy artillery positions. With their high rate of fire, they could outfight any tank on the battlefield. Although few in number, the Tigers performed outstanding feats in the offensive and defensive roles. Constantly under a hail of fire from anti-tank rifles, anti-tank guns and rocket launchers, the Tigers did not get off unscathed. However, thanks to their strong frontal armor, they were difficult to knock out. Often, shells fired by enemy tanks and anti-tank guns simply bounced off their frontal armor. Nevertheless, the Tiger was not invulnerable, and losses always kept pace with the slow trickle of new machines arriving at the front from the hard-pressed German factories. The incredible achievements of Wittmann on the battlefield did not go unnoticed. He was fast becoming a national hero. On the 2nd of February 1944, he was summoned to Hitler's headquarters. Michael Wittmann received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves from the hand of Adolf Hitler. In the course of his conversation with Wittmann, Hitler noticed that he was missing a front tooth as a result of his wounds. He subsequently sent him to his dentist to have the tooth replaced.
Michael Wittmann's success seems to have been based on a number of very great abilities. He is notorious for being able to work out where ambushes were likely to happen. He is described as having a sixth sense by a number of members of his unit for where enemy positions might be, especially where they might be at night. He was able to define where and when danger might appear. But Wittmann the man was very serious about fighting and about the war and about the success. He joined the SS because he believed wholeheartedly in Nazi doctrine, which was not uncommon at the time. But he was able to use that belief, that doctrine, and possibly became a somewhat serious young man. One illustration of that was, on frequent occasions, he was brought back from the front having been successful to train other troops. And there's one occasion on an icy winter morning when he was drilling some troops, and he had this habit of very sharply bringing his heels together. And on this particular occasion, in doing so, he completely skittled himself over, as he knocked himself down. And naturally, the troops he was training laughed at him for this. He had them doing extra duties for a month after that. So you get the impression of slightly humorless, but obviously very dedicated tank commander.
Wittmann also took advantage of this brief pause from the fighting to marry his sweetheart, Hildegard Burmester. Once again, it was an unmistakably Nazi event. After the wedding ceremony, performed by the civil magistrate, Wittmann accepted a gift copy of Mein Kampf. A speech was then given by SS Sturmbannführer Pein, who declared that the philosophy of life of the Teutons still had meaning in their lives. Wittmann's period of calm was to prove short-lived. On June the 6th, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. It was here that he would gain lasting fame.
Conditions for German tank crews in Normandy must have been quite horrific. The superiority of the Allied Air Force at the time meant that any movement out of cover was almost always latched upon straight away. If you look at any of the photographs of tank crews during the Normandy campaign, they're frequently looking up at the sky, keeping a very good watch out. Large amounts of armour congregating in order to make an attack, which is the only effective way of using armour, would almost certainly have been attacked very quickly by any Allied aircraft. Must have made the conditions quite horrific.
On the morning of June the 13th, 1944, Wittmann was positioned near Villers-Bocage when he surprised a squadron of the County of London Yeomanry. The unsuspecting British troops had stopped for breakfast when Wittmann's Tiger roared up. In no time, the lightning reflexes of Wittmann and Bobby Voll had claimed 12 half-tracks, 3 light tanks, and 6 medium tanks. Wittmann then dashed back and gathered 3 other Tigers and a Panzer IV. At 8 o'clock, a lookout reported to SS Obersturmführer Wittmann that a large column of enemy tanks was advancing on the Caen-Villers-Bocage road. Wittmann, who was in cover with his Tiger south of the road, saw a British armoured battalion followed by an English armoured troop carrier battalion advancing for Villers-Bocage. The situation called for immediate action. Wittmann was unable to get orders to his other tanks, who had moved off. Instead, he immediately drove at the English column with his single tank, firing on the move. This rapid intervention initially split the column. From 80 meters, Wittmann destroyed 4 Sherman Firefly tanks, positioned his Tiger next to the column, and drove 10 to 30 meters beside it, firing in his direction of travel along the column. He succeeded in knocking out 12 enemy tanks in a very short time. The accompanying battalion in armoured troop carriers was almost completely wiped out. The following German tanks and infantry company took about 130 prisoners, but Wittmann drove on in advance of his company into the town of Villers-Bocage.
It's a very interesting scene to look at when you see how he positioned himself and basically knocked these things off one by one by one. In other words, it was by no means a Turkish shoot, but it was extremely good tactical handling. It's an absolute masterpiece of individual tank fighting and what could be done by an extremely skilled commander with obviously an expert crew and a very good tank, by the way.
Just before the Hotel de Bras d'Or, he destroyed another Sherman, and then found himself facing several enemy tanks at the exit from the town, the Jeanne d'Arc Square. He subsequently turned his Tiger around and drove back down the main street. As it passed the Hugh Godefroy clothing store, the Tiger was hit by a shell fired by an anti-tank gun, which wrecked one of the drive sprockets. Nevertheless, he still destroyed all the enemy vehicles in range and scattered the enemy unit. At this point, Wittmann himself takes up the story. I then decided to abandon the tank. We took all the weapons we could carry, but I didn't destroy the tank, as I believed that we could regain possession of it. I made my way to the next division, about 15 kilometers away. We had to dodge enemy tanks several times, could have taken them out, but had no close-range anti-tank weapons. So with a heavy heart, we had to leave them be. I reached the division and immediately reported to it. The subsequent counterattack destroyed the enemy and took the town. The bulk of the armoured regiment and a rifle battalion were destroyed. Sepp Dietrich, his senior commander, later expressed his admiration in his report. Wittmann had made his way north on foot, approximately 15 kilometers to the headquarters of the Panzer-Lehr Division. From there, he turned about with 15 Panzer IVs of the Panzer-Lehr Division and once again headed for Villers-Bocage. Through his determined action, Wittmann and his Tiger tank destroyed the greater part of a powerful British offensive column, and acting solely on his own initiative and displaying the highest personal bravery, he averted a threat to the entire front of the 1st SS Panzer Corps. At that time, there were no reserves available to the Corps. With today's action, Wittmann has destroyed 138 enemy tanks and 132 anti-tank guns with his tank. Signed, Dietrich, SS Obergruppenführer Panzer General der Waffen-SS.
Quite clearly the engagement at Villers-Bocage was important. It prevented one of a series of British attempts to outflank the important communications centre and city of Caen from the west. However, to argue that Michael Wittmann or indeed any other individual could seriously have influenced the course of the campaign in the Normandy area is nonsensical. Quite clearly no individual could have made a substantial difference to a campaign that was determined at much higher levels.
In response to this incredible feat, the highest tally of armor destroyed by a single tank in a single day's fighting, the Führer awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords to SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commander of a heavy panzer company. Wittmann was the 71st soldier of the German armed forces to be so honored. Hitler knew the value of Wittmann as a national hero and pressed him to accept a post as a tank instructor where he could pass on his hard-won knowledge. Wittmann instead rejoined his battalion at the front. He felt he was needed there, and his deep-rooted sense of duty would not let him accept a cushy job. Wittmann knew that the war had entered its decisive phase. In spite of the material superiority of the enemy, which he had seen and experienced firsthand in Normandy, Wittmann was optimistic as he drove back to the front. He had only been able to spend a very short time with his young wife before he said goodbye and set out for Normandy. It was to be his last assignment. On August the 8th, 1944, Wittmann rode into his last battle. In an otherwise unremarkable encounter, his borrowed tank, bearing the number 007, was targeted by superior British forces. A direct hit blew the turret from the tank. Wittmann and his crew died instantly. The greatest tank hunter in the history of warfare was dead.
Michael Wittmann's credited with destroying 140 enemy tanks, and I'm afraid this comes under the scope of lies, damn lies and statistics. Whilst I wouldn't dispute that Wittmann scored a high number, it's fairly evident from events like Villers-Bocage, where he is credited with destroying 25 tanks. The recent evidence seems to suggest it was much nearer a half a dozen to a dozen tanks, and an awful lot of armoured personnel carriers, which have no effective defence or method of attack on the Tiger. Relating why this came about, during the Russian campaign, an awful lot of cricket scores were run up by successful tank commanders. And under this guise, it was very good for the media at home, for publicity, in order to keep morale up at home. The Germans were very proficient at pushing forward their tank aces, also their aircraft aces. During the Russian campaign, though, frequently they're up against quite inferior equipment. The T-34 is seen as an excellent piece of equipment, but most of the kills would have been amongst the much thinner armed light tanks that would have had no response or no adequate protection from the Tiger and no way of destroying it.
Wittmann and his crew are buried at La Cambre military cemetery in Normandy, near the site of his greatest victory at Villers-Bocage, a fitting resting place for a tireless warrior.